Good morning. Today we continue in our church-wide study looking at chapter 4, which discusses some of the tightly held excuses that stand in the way of fulfilling God's dream for us. So we'll return to this passage from Exodus chapter 3, Moses' burning bush story that we talked about last week, but we'll continue with the verses that follow as we look at some of the excuses that Moses offers God when God tries to give him his holy assignment. These excuses become barriers or obstacles to living out God's dream for him. One of the things I've been curious about as we've made our way through this church-wide study is the language that Slaughter uses in talking about how we respond to God. He uses the word purpose. He also uses the phrase life mission. He uses the phrase God dream to talk about what I've always thought of as calling. When I think about my purpose, my life mission, when I think about what God dreams for me, what I think about is God's call on my life. And so that's the way that we'll talk about this today, especially as we learn from Moses, who was not only given a purpose, was not only given a mission, but was offered a divine calling. Just like it was for Moses, my calling began with a burning bush experience. I was just 19 years old when that calling came. I'd made a full surrender of my life to Christ at a retreat, and I knew that church service was a part of the commitment that I was making to God. And I'd been volunteering for the youth group at my home church, Weddington UMC. And during this time, the youth director, John Jones, had taken me under his wing. And I was really enjoying working with him, and I was really learning a lot from him about ministry. And he pulled me aside one night, and he told me that he wanted to talk to me about something. And he pulled a little card out of his pocket, and he asked me to read it. And it had my name written on it. And he said that during his first week working at the church, that the senior pastor had given him this card, and he said that it included the name of a youth, that he should get involved in the ministry because she had leadership potential. He proceeded to tell me that he'd be leaving the church to go back to school and that he really thought I should direct the youth group in his absence. So he wanted me to pray about the position, and I did pray about it, and I felt led to apply for it, and I was hired. And so I was the youth director at Weddington UMC while I was in college, and before going to seminary, where I answered the call to full-time ministry. So I've thought a lot during this study about that burning bush experience and what it did for me. What it did is it gave me confidence that I couldn't possibly have had at 19 years old. I mean, Weddington was a large church. We had almost 100 kids participating in our program. And I was a young woman who was just looking for a place to serve. I wasn't trying to go into full-time ministry. I feel sure that there were plenty of naysayers who didn't think I was up to the task. But I could hear the words of God in JJ's voice, and somehow I knew that this wasn't just any conversation we were having. This was a holy conversation. I knew God was speaking through him that night. And I also knew that if God was calling me, he would equip me for the task. And on those days when I questioned this call, how God spoke through JJ that night served as a wonderful reminder to me. It reminded me that God had called me, that he would be with me, that he would give me the resources that I needed for this holy assignment. And this reminder was often just the encouragement I needed to persevere and to keep taking the next step in my calling. In Moses' burning bush experience, I really think God was trying to communicate some of the same things to him. It was certainly a holy assignment that God offered Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. God was giving Moses the assurance that he would equip him for the task he was calling him to. He would give him the resources that he needed to fulfill the mission. And on the days when he questioned himself, or when others questioned him, he could remember this experience with God, and he could take heart, being encouraged to take the next step in living out his calling. Moses didn't really seem encouraged by any of the assurances that God offered him, though. In fact, Moses offered every excuse in the book to avoid this holy task. We find some of them in chapter 3, but in chapter 4, we find a whole host of other excuses that he offers. Moses questions God, saying, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" He wondered when people asked him what this God's name was, what he was supposed to say to them. In chapter 4, he says, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" He continues, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past, nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." And finally, he says, "Please send someone else." It was obvious that Moses wondered what God was thinking in calling him to this task. It's easy to see that he was really plagued by a sense of inadequacy. He didn't think he had what it took to do the job. He didn't think he was qualified, and he imagined that no one else would think he was qualified either. He doubted himself, and he expected everyone else to do the same. He thought that surely there must have been someone else who was better suited for this task. It was obvious that Moses didn't have confidence in himself, and as he repeatedly disagrees with God, he's not only questioning himself, he's also questioning God. He's questioning God's choice. He's questioning God's call. He's questioning not only if people will have confidence in his leadership, but if people will have confidence in God's. It was clear that Moses really wondered if people believed in the God that was sending him. Moses' candor doesn't communicate the respect or confidence that God deserves. It was clear that Moses didn't really know who God was. He didn't really know what God was offering him. So God gives Moses a little bit of a talking to here by reminding him that I am has sent him. He reminds Moses not only of what the people needed to hear, but what he needed to hear too. The title I am, it garners respect and confidence. I am reminds people not only of God's sovereignty, but of the security they have in them. Because I am is with them. I am is for them. They can trust I am to fulfill his promises. God is so gracious with Moses in his insecurity. Not only does God remind him that he'll be with him, he'll provide what he needs for the task, but he also arranges for Moses' brother Aaron to go with him too. And if that wasn't enough, he provided Moses with the ability to perform miracles. I mean, what more could Moses ask for? God not only offered reassurance, but he offered real help, which should have given Moses the courage he needed to say yes. As I've been sitting with the chapter this week, I keep thinking about excuses that I've heard from people over the years when they have been offered a holy task to consider. And the most prevalent one you can imagine is, "I don't have time." And what that really means is this holy task isn't a priority to them. They don't have time for it. They're too busy focusing other things. We talked about this last week. Chasing their own personal interests is how it was said. Sometimes we can be so wrapped up in our own lives that we don't even put ourselves in a place where we can hear God's call for us. We can be so focused on getting what we want that we don't stop to consider what it is that other people need and how God might be calling us to meet that need. And we have to turn aside from this preoccupation if we ever hope to really consider God's call. There are certainly other excuses I've heard over the years. I often hear people say that they don't know enough about the Bible, that they aren't gifted enough, they aren't spiritual enough. Like Moses, they don't feel qualified. Sometimes they aren't sure that people will take them seriously or respect them. They think someone else might have more credibility than they do. And they often question why God would possibly choose them. And sometimes in these responses, you can tell that what people are really afraid of is failure. Maybe they've attempted something for God before and it didn't go so well. Maybe they made some mistakes along the way and now they're reluctant to really try again. Maybe they're afraid they won't be able to follow through. Maybe they would let God down. Maybe they would disappoint others. And every once in a while, I will hear someone say that they've just been through too much. They feel broken, and they see that brokenness as a limitation. They think they've somehow been compromised or disqualified from God's service. All of these things represent insecurities that can be barriers to hearing and answering God's call for us. They can be limitations that keep us from discerning that life mission, that purpose. They can actually paralyze us from discovering and living out God's dream for us. And they do reveal a lack of confidence in ourselves and a lack of confidence in our God. And in this insecurity, I think God offers us the same encouragement that he offered Moses. He's so gracious with us. He reminds us of who he is. He reminds us that he is I am, that I am is for us and will be faithful to us. He reminds us that he will go with us and will equip us for the task. And while he might not give us the ability to perform miracles like he did for Moses, he will provide us with the necessary resources that we need to fulfill the call. He will offer us real help in accomplishing the mission. Something that Slaughter reminded of us of in the chapter this week is that when we think about God's call, mission, or dream, we are all inadequate. If we can accomplish this task on our own, it's probably not from God. God doesn't expect us to accomplish the work by ourselves. He wants to partner with us. It's not our ability that makes us fit for God's service. It's our availability. Hear that again, friends. It's not our ability that makes us fit for God's service. It's our availability. We aren't the ones who do the work. God is. We just have to be willing to put ourselves into a place where we can hear God's voice. We can discern God's call. We can partner with God in living out this mission that is God's dream for us. Slaughter even quotes Eugene Peterson, saying that perhaps our inadequacy is the essential qualification that we need in order for God to use us. Perhaps what we see as a limitation, God sees as a strength. Just as God used what Moses thought he was worst at, God may use the things that we feel the least confident in. Maybe it's because in the places that we feel inadequate, we are more reliant on God to do the work. Reliance on God's Spirit, that's what enables us to do what God has called us to do. Who knows what work God could do through you and me when the Spirit really fills us up? It won't be work we can do on our own. It'll be work that God does through us. This certainly rings true with my experience. There have been times in my life when I really thought my ministry would be compromised because of the brokenness that results from loss. And time again, those broken places, they have been the places that God has used the most powerfully to help others. I think it's because they're the places where I had to count on God to do the work in me. My prayer has often been, God, I'm counting on you to do the work in me that I cannot do in myself. And that inner work, that work of the Spirit, is what really empowers our service to God and our service to others. So today we're invited to leave all the barriers behind, that stand in the way of fulfilling God's dream for us. We're invited to be freed from the limitations that keep us from discerning our purpose. We're invited to make the places in ourselves where we feel the most insecure, the most inadequate, and maybe even the most broken available to God. And then we're invited to take God's hand and partner with him in completing our mission. I believe this is how we discover our calling and live out God's dream for us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.